COVID-19. And so for today, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background on COVID. We've all been inundated with data and statistics and information in the news. And so I'm going to try and distill it down to some really salient points with some evidence behind them. Second, I want to talk about the importance of exercise in COVID. And so, the world is an anxious, stressed, and confined state of affairs right now. And I can't think of anything more beneficial for our population than SRLA and keeping our young individuals connected and active and moving. And so, there are going to be some challenges as we navigate training in this COVID landscape, but I also think it's absolutely essential that we continue to do this incredible work. And last, we'll talk about what those specific strategies are for success as we embark on a likely virtual training program. Okay, so first question is, why is COVID such a big problem? We have viruses all the time. We haven't had a pandemic since 1918, so what went wrong here? First, this is a novel virus. So this is not a virus that we've been exposed to for centuries. This is brand new to our entire human population. And so if you look at the diagram on the left side of the screen, you see what happens when two infected individuals walk into a room of these blue guys, which are non-infected individuals, and we have very rapid spread and dissemination of that virus amongst that population. However, when you have immunization, which is vaccine that stimulates antibodies and generates herd immunity, that's all these yellow guys who have been excellently vaccinated, you see a much slower spread despite infected individuals in that same cohort. And so when you have no population immunity, because this is a new novel virus, we're going to see much more significant spread. Number two, and this is the real kicker, is that people are contagious before they develop symptoms. So the average time from virus exposure to symptom onset is about 6.4 days, but that can be as long as 15.5 days. And so this is why if any of us have a high risk exposure, which is prolonged face-to-face contact with somebody with known coronavirus, we need to self-quarantine for 14 days. In America, we like round week numbers, so we chose 14 instead of 15. Then we develop our symptoms and they last on average 10 to 14 days. However, if you're hospitalized, they can last as long as 27 days on average. And then we have this unknown physiologic recovery period. The tricky part is when the contagious period starts, which is 2.3 days on average before your symptoms begin. So for 2.5 days, you are sick and spreading virus around the community before you even develop a cough, a fever, or any other sign that you're carrying the illness. And on average, your peak contagion, when you're shedding more virus than any other point in your entire infection, that time point is 0.7 days, so a half day before you develop symptoms. So for those 12 to 14 hours before you develop your first sniffle or cough, you are shedding an exceptionally large amount of virus. And so because of this contagion preceding symptoms, we now all have to wear masks and we all have to isolate in our homes and socially distance because we can't rely on symptoms to tell us who's sick and spreading the virus. So how does COVID spread? And I think we are all now very aware and have seen way too many of these slow time lapse videos of people sneezing and coughing and breathing with droplets spreading all over the universe. And so we know that just with that normal respiratory breathing that we're going to disperse aerosolized particles somewhere between 3 and 6 feet. Okay, and so this is why that magic number of socially distancing 6 feet apart comes from. But then when we cough or sneeze, we can actually project those viral particles all the way out to 12 feet. And so again, this is why we need masks to protect against those coughs and sneezes. But if you are coughing or sneezing, just stay in your house, and that way we don't have to change the rule to 12 feet. But what about running outdoors? And this is some modeling that came out of an engineering group in Europe, where they put people in a wind tunnel and they had them breathe and they tracked what happened to their aerosolized particles as they ran down the road. And then they put people behind them and realized they were just running in this breath plume. And they identified that these viral particles can actually spread as far as 30 feet, okay? This freaked everybody out in the running world, and we all started wearing masks and staggering from one another. But we'll talk a little bit more about this later. later. But what they didn't take into account was the viral dose needed to actually make you sick, which is about 1,000 viral particles. And so to inhale 1,000 viral particles while you're out running around, you actually have to be much closer to this person than 30 feet, probably within that 6-foot distance, and working really hard to suck in all the air that they're breathing out, just because of the nature of the way air disperses in an outdoor environment. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So how does COVID stack up against all the viruses we've ever seen historically? And this is what I call the power rankings of viruses. On the y-axis here, you have the deadliness of the virus. So for example, MERS, this is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or bird flu, or Ebola. Really, really deadly, not horribly contagious. Then on the x-axis, we have contagion. So the farther you go towards the right here, the more contagious a virus is. So we have things like chickenpox or measles, which are really, really contagious, but not really deadly. And COVID is this perfect storm of a combination of the two of them, pretty moderately contagious and moderately deadly. And so it's really stacking up somewhere in the middle of this grid here. The next question is, who is affected by COVID? And this is data actually taken from yesterday from the LA County Department of Health. So this is our local county data. These two bars are representing, one, the percentage of the population made up in that age group. So this dark blue bar right here, looking at less than 5, 12 to 17, 18 to 29, this is what percentage of the LA County population is in that age bracket. And us in the SRLA population is that 12 to 17-year-old group. And it looks like there's somewhere between 5 to 10% of the population is 12 to 17. This light blue bar is then the percentage of COVID positive people in that age bracket. And so while 12 to 17-year-olds make up almost 10% of the population, they're less than 5% of the COVID cases. So the kids are doing a good job. Let's skip forward a couple of bars to us, the 18 to 29-year-olds, 30 to 49-year-olds, and 50 to 64-year-olds. And we see that we are not doing a good job. So we've got many more cases, these tall blue bars, relative to our percentage of the population. And so this is why you're hearing in the news over and over again that it is spreading like wildfire in the 18 to 50-year-old population. So the next question is, who is affected by COVID-19? And you know, we're hearing that we're all affected differently and has a highly unpredictable outcomes. We know that age is a huge risk factor. And so this first chart I'm going to show you here shows the rates of hospitalizations in pink, ICU admissions in red, and case fatalities in black. And we can see that as you get older, you are more likely to be hospitalized, admitted to the ICU, and die from COVID-19, where death rate is over 10% in the 85 and up population. But in the young group, everyone under 19, those numbers are extremely low. So while this is a relatively safe virus in the young people in our coaches demographic, it can be scarier. And that being said, it is still not, the risk is not zero in the young folks. We also know more about the risk factors for death from COVID-19. So this is a study looking at various comorbidities and how they affect our risk of having a severe outcome or death from the virus. And we've identified things like cancer, chronic lung disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, which is like coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis, hypertension, male gender, interestingly. So men tend to fare more poorly than women, and age, which we already addressed. A quick note on chronic lung disease. So asthma is a big question that we get and is very common in runners, especially middle school and high school age runners. We know that mild and moderate, well-controlled asthma does not increase your risk of complication from COVID-19. But severe, uncontrolled asthma absolutely does. And so really making sure we're taking good care of our asthmatics and getting their asthma under control is essential now more than ever. So next is the question is, why do we have these variability in symptoms, right? So we just talked about medical conditions. I told you that as we age, you're more likely to have a bad outcome. But what about the 19-year-olds that are dying, or the 34-year-old ICU doctors we're hearing about dying from COVID? So we're still digging into the why in those particular scenarios. For one, we know that blood type seems to affect it. So blood type A seems to be more likely to develop the virus or catch the virus, and more likely to have a more severe outcome relative to blood type O. And we don't know why. Again, this is observational data. And next is the unknown. We've had hundreds, getting close to thousands of deaths in young people in the US. And we think there's some combination of genetics. People are just predisposed to poor outcomes. but also potentially this immune system overreaction. So as we age, our immune system doesn't mount a strong enough response and the virus overwhelms us. But in the young, we can have a really robust immune system reaction. And if the immune system overreacts already in this very pro-inflammatory virus, it can lead to a lot of complications, more so than the virus in and of itself. So next we have to find out how Los Angeles is doing. The simple takeaway is not great. Our first case in Los Angeles was January 26th, 2020. Since then, we have had 178,000 cases. So this makes up more than 38.3% of all cases in the state of California. As a comparison, the population of Los Angeles County makes up about 12% of the state of California's population. So we should be at 12% of the cases, but we're at close to 40. The chart below here, you can see how these new cases have been trending since that time. So we were steadily rising all the way until mid to late July, and we have been slowly downtrending since then as we've instituted more restrictions in terms of going out and opening of businesses. In terms of deaths, we've had 4,427, so that's 51% of the deaths in the state of California, relative again to 12% of the population. And last, this graph on the right shows where these cases are located within the county. So on the coast, you see this lighter blue, that's a relatively low density of cases. And as we head into central and south Los Angeles, we're seeing a much higher density of cases. So again, these tend to be concentrating in a more underserved, low socioeconomic portion of the county, which is what we've seen paralleled across the country. Next, I want to talk a little bit about testing. There are two coronavirus tests, okay? One of them is called a PCR, or polymerase chain reaction test, which is testing for viral RNA. So this is genetic code from the virus. This test is used to identify an active infection. It's a very accurate test. Our test at UCLA approaches almost 98-99% sensitivity and specificity. It's slow, although it has gotten much faster, now down to a 24 to 48 hour turnaround time, and it has been relatively expensive, although it is becoming more affordable as we have been able to scale up the number of labs and the operational efficiency of those labs. The second test is a test for immunity. So this is looking for antibodies to the virus, which is your immune system's memory and sign that your immune system has reacted to appropriately to the virus. And there are two different types of antibodies that are important: IgG, which is your lasting immunity, and your IgM, which is your very acute or recent immunity. So IgG is going to be the most important. And so now we have point of care and lab blood tests looking for the presence of these antibodies. This test is useful in terms of telling if somebody has had the virus in the past, but does not tell me if you actively have the virus. So on the topic of antibodies, the biggest question we need to answer right now is, do antibodies confer immunity? Meaning, if I have antibodies, am I protected from being reinfected? And we do not have the answer to this question right now. That being said, we do have promising data. And this includes one study that showed antibodies did confer immunity in monkeys. We are not monkeys. And so we cannot extrapolate monkey data to human data, but they're the closest animal model we have. So looking good. Number two, most coronaviruses, antibodies confer immunity, albeit short-lived. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So coronaviruses are all over the community. They're very common in parks and playgrounds, and little kids get them all the time. Obviously not new coronaviruses and less severe, but we see lasting antibodies in that population. So number three, there is very little reported reinfection with COVID-19. Studies that have looked at reinfection rates show that on average, about 2% of people have been reinfected at a later date with coronavirus. Now, the keynote here is that the false positive rate, meaning test tells you you have coronavirus, but you don't actually have coronavirus, is about 2%. So it could just be that we're picking up that 2% false positive rate as well. So let's assume we finally get the enough data to support the fact that antibodies do equal immunity. We then need to figure out how long they last. And if you remember, the first case of coronavirus occurred in December, which means that this virus is not even a year old, okay? So we can't answer how long antibodies last until we are farther out from virus onset. So first we went and looked back at SARS-CoV-1. If you can remember, in the 90s, there was the original SARS coronavirus that spread in Southeast Asia. And so we tracked those individuals and found that usually by 3 months out, almost 100% of people had antibodies. They tended to peak 4 to 6 months post-infection, and then they started to decline at about 16 months, whereas by 4 years, only about 50 to 75% still had antibodies, and by 6 years, only 8% did. Okay, so in the spectrum of antibody timeline, this isn't incredibly long, but it's decent. So then we started to look at SARS-CoV-2 antibodies, which is the exact question we need to answer. And so far, we only have data 2 months out from infection. In this really interesting study they published in Nature, they actually differentiated the length of antibody persistence, both in symptomatic individuals, so people that developed fever or cough or chills or headache or any symptom with the virus, versus those who were asymptomatic, who were tested positive but never developed symptoms. And 2 months post-infection, the symptomatic individuals, 87% still had antibodies. In the asymptomatic individuals, only 60% still had antibodies. And so there's clearly something about that asymptomatic case that is less likely to lead to the development of antibodies. But again, jury is still out about how useful these antibodies are. So really now the most important question is, when is this all going to be over? Right? And to try and answer this question, we had to go way back to 1918, the Spanish flu. All of us physicians have been dusting off our medical history books. And this is the pattern that we saw in 1918. We saw wave 1 in the summer of 1918, which was small. As we headed into the fall, we saw a big surge, the biggest surge of the Spanish flu pandemic. And then we saw a third wave 3 in the winter of 1919. So when I first started researching coronavirus back in March, I put together this prediction, which involved wave 1 in the spring of 2020, with a wave 2 in the summer and a wave 3 in the fall. Sadly, our wave 1 looked like this. Our wave 2 has been much larger than our wave 1. And so we're starting to now see that downtick, but we're all very apprehensive heading into the fall and winter in terms of what that third wave may look like as everybody heads indoors with colder weather. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about the importance of what we're doing here in SRLA as we head into the pandemic and try and run SRLA in parallel to COVID-19. So first and foremost, I wanted to share a position statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is our North Star with regard to care of the young athlete. And they very recently, actually last Thursday, published a position statement on exercise and sport amidst COVID-19. I want to share this particular excerpt, which talks about the benefits of returning to sports in children and adolescents. They said that re-engaging in sports activity with friends has both physical and psychological health benefits for children and adolescents. Participating in sports allows youth to improve their cardiovascular health, strength, body composition, and overall fitness. Mentally, youth may experience benefits from the increased socialization with friends and coaches, as well as from the return to a more structured routine. These psychological and physical benefits can help support their developmental growth. Exercise also has immune system benefits, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But I couldn't have summarized the benefit of what we are doing at SRLA better, and I would argue the benefits of SRLA participation extend well beyond this summary statement. So first, we know that exercise is going to mitigate anxiety, and if you haven't noticed by walking around at the grocery store in your neighborhood, the world is very anxious right now. So the American Psychiatric Association did a study looking at rates of anxiety and related symptoms in the population at large in the US. 19% of people reported having trouble sleeping compared to baseline, 8% having consuming more alcohol or other drugs and substances relative to pre-COVID, 12% report fighting more with a partner or a loved one. For our young athletes, this includes siblings and parents. And 24% report trouble concentrating on other things because they are thinking about coronavirus. And I would argue that many of these are probably underreported. But we know that exercise is both a healthy and an effective anxiolytic whose only side effect is muscle soreness, which many of us don't mind. So really, really nice way to counteract the known anxiety that our population's experiencing. Number two, exercise improves mood. So studies have shown that a rigorous workout routine produces endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, and many other neurotransmitters that improve our mood, both immediately following the workout and over time. Dopamine, which is a key player in the reward center of our brain, is upregulated when we exercise, and so we see increases during and after a workout. And we know that consistent exercise is going to lead to lasting changes in brain chemistry, the effects of which mimic those of antidepressants. So we can give you all of the good of an antidepressant without all the side effects of the antidepressant. Oh, and by the way, it's good for your cardiorespiratory system. Lastly, exercise supports the immune system, and I can't think of a time when immune health is more important. There are a number of really interesting ways that exercise is going to help boost our immune response, but just distilled down for the purpose of this talk today, number one, it's augmenting our immunosurveillance. So we're doing a better job of identifying pathogens, bacteria, virus, other things trying to invade our system. And number two, it's reducing our systemic inflammation. So again, COVID-19 is a pro-inflammatory virus. And so if we can minimize the inflammation within our vascular system, that's going to be helpful for us. Okay, so I think it is safe to say we all agree that running through the pandemic is going to be good for everybody. So how do we do it safely and effectively? And I'm going to give this to you guys as a series of tips that I've really distilled down from all the data that is bouncing around out there. So tip number one is keep it outside. For us as runners, this is a pretty easy thing to do. You can imagine hockey, basketball, these are all going to be more challenging sports to return. But for us as runners, keeping things outside is pretty natural. A little bit of data to support that recommendation. So this is an article that was published describing a SARS outbreak on a flight from Hong Kong to Beijing early in the pandemic. This little box right here with the red plus was the infected patient on the flight, and all these red boxes were people who subsequently developed the virus shortly after that flight. And so I would argue that these people way up in the front, this stewardess up here, and this guy way in the back was more than 6 feet away from this individual. But because of the circulated air system within the airplane, there's pretty rapid spread. This is what we call a super spreader event. And so indoor transmission, because of the circulated air, behaves in very unpredictable ways. This is another case report from an outbreak in a restaurant in China. And so this person sitting right here at the table A in the yellow with the red around them was the infected patient. Because of the air conditioning blowing across the room, just specifically on that side, all these red circles were subsequent patients who developed COVID after exposure at that single dining event, versus the opposite side of the room with no cases. Again, all based on airflow within that restaurant. And so the key takeaway from these two studies is that when you are in a confined space and airflow is unpredictable, it is very hard to prevent the spread of COVID. Number two, we're finding that we see reduced transmission outdoors. So we know indoors is bad, but is outdoors safer? And the answer is yes. This first study was 1,245 cases reviewed from China. Only 2 of the 1,245 cases occurred via outdoor transmission. Both of these cases had prolonged face-to-face contact without masks. So again, very unlikely to have outdoor transmission relative to all the other ways we're seeing it spread. Second study was done in Japan. This looked at 110 cases where they did contact tracing. They identified that there was an 18.7 times greater rate of transmission indoors versus outdoors. So again, free-flowing air, wide open spaces, easier social distancing, outdoors seems to be relatively safe. The other key factor is the sunlight. And so this was a study that came from a lab. So this is not done outdoors, but done in a lab simulating sunlight. And they took viruses and they put them on various surfaces and they saw how long they lasted and if they were able to survive when exposed to the equivalent of outdoor sunlight. So first, they saw that 90% of infectious virus was inactivated within 6.8 minutes of sun exposure when they were cultured in saliva. So this is very similar to how we would expect it to spread via respiratory droplet. We also found that 90% of infectious virus was inactivated in 14.3 minutes when we put it in culture media. So we take virus, we put it in a petri dish full of Miracle-Gro, and the sunlight still kills it, even though it's in Miracle-Gro. So again, sunlight seems to have some effect in terms of killing the virus as well. So the combination of open air, able to space out, free-flowing breezes, and then sunlight all seems to be in our favor, which in Southern California is very helpful. So my practical strategy for you when it comes to SRLA training is absolutely no indoor gatherings. If you need to have a team meeting, try and make it virtual if possible, or if you have to be in person, at an absolute minimum, outdoor and spaced out. Number two, cross training. So we've been encouraging cross training for a long time, yoga and strength training and all things that make us good runners and reduce our injury risk. These activities all need to be moved outdoors. So for our UCLA athletics program, we have taken all of the weights out of the weight room and moved them onto the football field. And so now everybody's lifting weights outdoors, spaced out at least 6 feet apart, ideally even more than that. And so we've just found a way to adapt our cross training into that outdoor spaced out environment. So tip number two, if you take the advice from these very sweet young ladies, we need to space out. So some quick data about that. First, we know that distance reduces aerosolized particle density, right? So if I'm standing right next to this person who is coughing, these aerosolized particles are going to extend somewhere out to 9 feet. If I'm next to that person just breathing, they're going to extend somewhere out to about 6 feet, okay? So again, spacing out at least 6 feet seems to be that magic number for reducing at least breath-related aerosolized particles. Next, we have good data that shows that physical distancing, here they're looking at just 1 meter of distancing, so not that 6 feet or 2 meters, but 1 meter. We reduce the rate of transmission from 12.8% when you're less than a meter all the way out to 2.6%. So this is almost a 5x reduction in viral transmission simply by standing more than a meter apart. So some practical strategies here. First and foremost, keep running groups small. Right? And the reason small is important is because the larger the group gets, the more likely we are to congregate. So the magic number that LA County is using is less than 10. There's no science behind that number. Somebody made that up again because we as Americans like round numbers. But the smaller the better, okay? And it's, again, it's unlikely that we're going to be meeting in large groups for SRLA as we usually do, but if people do meet up in smaller groups, smaller is better. Number two, we need to stay 6 feet apart, and these are the times when I'm concerned. Warm up and cool down. That's when we as runners like to get close together, chat, catch up, do all of those fun things that makes running great. So especially during those times when we are just innately closer together, we need to learn to space ourselves out. While running, again, we usually like to run with a buddy right next to us and catch up during those times. So we've got to stay at least 6 feet apart at all times while we're running. And then the last thing that I think a lot of us don't think about is stoplights and intersections. We've got plenty of those here in LA. And so when we're at stoplights and intersections, you just instinctively need to start to space each other out or stop a little bit before the intersection until that light turns green. Next is wear a mask, but the caveat here is sometimes, and we'll talk a little bit about why. First, in general, masks are good. So we know that masks reduce the national death rate. This is a study looking at how quickly a country instituted universal masking following the first case. So this blue line is people that instituted universal masking within 15 days of their first case, and ta-da, death rate stays low the whole time. The yellow line is those who waited anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks to institute universal masking. So you see this uptick in deaths, then it slides back down because we figured it out. And then you've got the countries that have not instituted universal masking, or it took them more than 2 months. And you can see the death rate climbed exponentially. And so again, we know it's good because it's reducing deaths. Number two, we know that it's reducing transmission rates, so not just deaths, but also just infective spread. And so without intervention, again, we see a spreading rate of about 17.4%. With masks, we can reduce that down to 3.1%. So if I told you I had a magic vitamin that you could take that would reduce your risk of developing COVID-19 by greater than 5 times, it would be sold out faster than toilet paper. And that pill, that vitamin is your mask, okay? So the majority of the time we need to be masked. The question is, what about running? And so to answer that question, we go to the American Academy of Pediatrics and their position statement about youth sports. And these are the recommendations. Number one, you need to wear that cloth face covering as a coach, official, spectator, volunteer, i.e. people not playing the sport or actively exercising. That's common sense. Number two, all individuals need to wear a mask when they are coming to and leaving the training facilities, okay? Number three, they need to wear a mask when they're on the sidelines. Now, there's not really a sideline in the race, but there's an end of the race as people are just kind of milling about. So when you're not actively running, you need to have your mask on. Number four, and this is most important, the World Health Organization does not recommend the use of a cloth face covering during vigorous exercise. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has agreed with this and has made this their recommendation as well. So while doing your intense running workout, you do not need to wear a mask. But number five, when that vigorous exercise is done, you need to put that mask right back on. Okay, so what does a practical strategy look like for this? Number one, all runners should show up to workouts wearing a buff around their neck. Then they should pull that buff up over their face during warm-up, at stoplights, and during cool down, okay? So it's around their neck, easy to access at all times, up over their face for those strategic times. And number three, as it is on many of our crowded LA streets, if the street is crowded and you cannot physically be 6 feet apart while you're running, you got to pull it on for that short period of time until you're able to space out again. Okay, so it's really any time that you're not able to be 6 feet apart or any time that you're not vigorously exercising. And lastly, if you get COVID, do not exercise. And we are having an increasing body of data that's telling us why this is the case. I had a track and field coach in high school who told me that I should run off a cold. And that's been my motto ever since. COVID is not the one to run off, and this is why. Number one, COVID-19 is pro-inflammatory. A hematologist explained to me that this is a vascular virus. This is not a pulmonary virus. This is not a lung virus. This is an arteries, veins, and heart virus that creates tons of inflammation, and then that inflammation manifests as all of the other symptoms that we develop. And so there's a significant risk of cardiovascular complications in at-risk patients. The risk of cardiac inflammation in young, healthy people is unknown, however. So that cardiac inflammation, fluid around the heart, fluid inside of the heart is unknown, and we're working really frantically to figure out what that true risk is. The National Federation of High Schools put together this really complicated but helpful algorithm for how to manage return to sport from a cardiac perspective in sick individuals. And they also nicely included a column all the way here on the right that says what we should do about exercise while we're sick. And it very specifically says no exercise for 14 days once you are test positive, and only light exercise 7 days after symptom resolution. So what does this mean in terms of our exercise recommendations? So in an athlete who tests positive, and again, we are doing everything in our power to reduce the spread, but given the widespread nature in Los Angeles County, we have to anticipate positives. So in an athlete that does test positive, our recommendations are no exercise for 14 days following that positive test, and you cannot do any resuming of exercise until 7 days post-symptom resolution. So if you are sick for 1 day and then plus 7 days, that puts you 8 days post-positive test, you still may not exercise. So it's a minimum of 14 days and symptoms resolve for 7 days. Lastly, I would encourage, if possible, that all COVID positive runners meet with their pediatrician before returning to their training program. Again, looking at this algorithm, there are very specific cardiac tests that we want to do in patients based on their symptoms and their exam. And so the safest thing we can do for our runners is to encourage them to see their pediatrician, get a cardiac exam before returning to running. I understand this is not possible for everyone, but should be our best practice. And with that, I just want to say thank you guys for all the amazing things that you do. COVID is not a fun time. This is not life as we know it. The world has been very stressful and challenging for us as adults, but even more so for young people who are trying to navigate school and virtual relationships and all of these things. And I think you guys can really be a shining beacon for them in this pretty stressful time. So Mark, I burned a lot of time again, I'm sorry, but let's definitely open it up for questions.
I have a question. This is David Valle from Poly High School. And what interested me is the information you gave about that European study about the wind tunnel.
Yes.
Um, I wanted to see what was your opinion regarding that same kind of concept of being in a wind tunnel, and but this time instead of applying the concept of breathing in those virus particles attached to people's clothes. So suppose somebody's running behind somebody else, and those virus particles attach themselves to clothes. Um, what is the risk factor for being around a person who has a lot of virus particles on their clothes?
That's an excellent question. And so, again, we're learning how this virus is similar and how it is different from many other viruses. In general, this virus tends to spread via respiratory particles that we inhale. So to get that viral load needed for infection, which is about 1,000 viral particles, you really need a lot of virus off your clothes. You have to be licking your shirt and then inhaling that licked fluid into your lungs to really to take virus from clothes and infect yourself. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just much less likely than somebody breathing in you and you breathing in that air, right? So on the safe side, you notice my scrubs, we wear scrubs to clinic every day now. I bring them home at the end of the day and I put them in the washing machine. So if you're doing any outdoor behaviors or where you're potentially exposed to a lot of virus, I think the conservative, safe thing to do is to immediately take those clothes off, put them in the laundry and wash your hands, right? Or put them in the laundry bin. But that being said, that seems not to be the way the virus spreads. It seems to be a little bit different from other viruses in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I have a question. Phil Hale from United American Indian Involvement. Do you have any information or answers about the vaccine? I've heard different information promising that it's, by fall there'll be a vaccine, and other not so promising information saying it's still a long ways out in getting a vaccine. So I was wondering about yourself. Do you have any information on a vaccine?
Yeah, so this is quite a rabbit hole to run down, but I do want to give you guys a little information about it. There are a number of vaccines in development. The majority of them are targeting the same protein on the virus, which means we're putting a lot of our eggs in one basket. Meaning that if that concept of virus doesn't pan out, all of those vaccines are scrapped. But that being said, the early vaccine data is good. Now, a couple interesting facts. The shortest time we have ever gone from new virus to vaccine was with measles, and that took 4 years. So we're trying to accelerate what we've done in 4 years and distill that down to a year. That's going to take a heroic effort. Everything has to go perfectly along that entire path, meaning we need to see good immune response. We need to see not a ton of side effects. We need to see that response protects us against the virus. The Moderna vaccine, which is an mRNA vaccine, which is a new type of vaccine altogether, is the most promising one, but we still have to answer a lot of questions about side effects and then about sort of long-term outcomes from that vaccine, which we may not have. So if everything goes perfectly, then sometime in the winter, spring of 2021, we will have a vaccine. Once we have that vaccine, then we have to prioritize who gets it. And our students who are young, healthy people will be lower on that list. In general, we prioritize the youth, but like that data showed, the youth is doing the best with the virus. So they need the least help from us. And so the priority is going to be the old and the people with comorbidities in terms of vaccinations first, and then it'll work its way down to the lower risk population. So I think for this season, vaccine is off the table for SRLA would be my recommendation in terms of as we're planning.
Hey, Dr. Goldman, I hate to interrupt. We could pick your brain for the next 4 or 5 hours. But we have another presenter coming on soon. I know that your material is available for us to have access to. But again, if we could give you a round of applause that you could hear, it would be, like I said earlier, it'd be deafening. So thank you so much for everything. And I'm sure that this is going to generate more questions, and I know where to find you. So thank you.
I know Kimberly had her hand raised. She probably had a question. Summer just posted her email address on the chat. So if you guys have any additional questions, also feel free to reach out.
Good.
Thanks, Josh.
So I am going to move.